An American climatologist, Mark Cerise, once called the process of ice melting in the North Pole the Arctic death spiral. And predictions based on mathematical models tell us that complete ice melting in the North Pole could occur even at the half of this century. But why should we trust these predictions?
Well, the predictions are actually based on observations. I would say if predictions that aren't based on observations, sometimes one is suspicious of them. But these are based on many years of observation of the retreat of sea ice and the thinning of sea ice. So if we look at how the volume of sea ice has decreased over the last 30 years, then the trend is so strong that if you extrapolate the trend forward, then you'll get these quite early disappearance of the sea ice, starting with the summer and then later in the winter as well.
And what would happen if the Arctic death spiral would proceed in its own path?
Well, it's called a death spiral because he just found a way of representing it in terms of a rotating vector. So you can see the amounts of sea ice going down as you rotate around from 30 years ago to today. So it's a spiral. It shouldn't be a spiral if nothing was changing, but because things are changing, it's a spiral. So he calls it a death spiral. And the months where there's the minimum amount of ice, that's September, look like they're going to go to zero first, and that will happen quite soon. Perhaps 2, 3, 4 years' time. Then the months just before and after August and October will last a little bit longer, and then the winter months themselves will lose ice over a few decades, and it'll all be gone not very far into the future. Even the winter ice will end up going by early next century, probably.
You know that most of the people living in the Western civilized world don't really feel this as a domestic problem, including politicians. And sometimes scientists like you are even, accused of being catastrophists when they talk about climate change. But why do we struggle so much when we talk about climate change and understanding its effects?
Well, it's something wrong with human nature, I think. One of the problems is that everything is accelerating. All the warming trends and the changes associated with them are accelerating changes. So that means that if you look back in the past, things have been only changing slowly. But if you look forward into the future, the acceleration means you're running up against a cliff. So people don't really want to accept that. They'd rather hope that things will keep on changing slowly so they can cope with them. That's one thing. And people are used to thinking of climate as something that is fairly steady. You think about when spring coming, summer, autumn, winter. There's a cycle which has been there forever and will always be there. People don't really like to think about that cycle being completely upset. It's a very fundamental cycle about the way we live. So to have that completely upset by some really radical changes is something that is unwelcome to think about. And if it's unwelcome to think about it, it's easier not to think about it. And you do that by ignoring the people who bring forward the evidence.
One of the most interesting concepts that is presented in the book, I mean, there are many, but I'm referring to climate feedback. Can you tell us something about it very briefly?
Well, the feedback is recent. It really came about because all the years I've been working on sea ice, about 40 years or so, we were looking just at its basic properties. And then we started to see it was changing. But the changes, which are due to global warming, are not purely just in the direction of losing sea ice. If you just lost the sea ice, that would be a curiosity. You'd regret it, but it wouldn't mean any more. But the trouble is, the loss of sea ice has feedback effects which affect every other part of the climate system. And that includes some really serious parts of the climate system, like global sea level. As the sea ice melts, it warms up Greenland, and as the Greenland ice melts, that really accelerates the rate of sea level rise. So there's effects like that that influence the entire planet, because sea level is the same over the whole planet, but they arise from changes in the Arctic. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was that I was very concerned that the changes in the Arctic that you're tempted to think of as being isolated are not isolated at all. They're affecting the entire global climate.
And the book ends with a call to arms. What can we do today to face this problem?
Well, just before the book was completed, there was the Paris Climate Agreement. And at first sight, that was a wonderful thing, because all the countries in the world had agreed that they would reduce their emissions to the point where we would limit warming to 2 degrees. But the trouble is, having said they would do that, none of them have done it, and there's been no decrease in the rate of growth of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The reason, many reasons, but again, it's to doing with you don't really want to change your way of life so as to be too uncomfortable. And the problem is that if all you do is increase carbon dioxide content more slowly by reducing emissions, you're not solving the problem. You're in fact making it worse, because at some stage in the future, things are going to get terrible and unlivable. All we're doing is slowing the rate at which that happens. The only way to cure climate change and get rid of the greenhouse effect is to get rid of what's causing it, which is carbon dioxide. So I don't see why it's not obvious that if we can find ways to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a reasonable cost, then we've solved the problem. We get the climate down to what it was before industrialization. So I'm in favor of making a very big engineering issue out of developing carbon dioxide removal, direct air capture it's called, taking it out of the atmosphere and doing something with it so that it's not in the atmosphere anymore. And it can be done. There's no unknown science there. It's simply technology that needs further development to make it more reasonable in cost. So that's my really big plea at the end of this book is, please, let's go for direct air capture and take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Thank you very much, Professor.